Amir, it is awesome to see you. We've had a number of conversations. It's good to finally get one of these things on tape. And I don't know that people really say on tape as much anymore other than me, but here we go. We're on tape. How are you doing?
I'm great. Yeah. Just the usual startup struggles and trying to stay sane and all of those good things that I'm sure you're familiar with.
Wait, what's got you super excited right now that's like kind of drawing you between potentially being pulled into insanity and still being able to maintain a level of focus and being sane? What's kind of pulling you in different directions or getting you excited?
Yeah. I mean, these days, an interesting thing that is happening in my life is that, the struggles of, building a startup and all of those good things is always there. But, these days I'm spending a lot more time thinking about, it's been more than 4 years. It's almost 5 years. And it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. How do you sustain performance over such a long time? And I recently, whenever I'm at a, fork in the road like that, I always gather a bunch of people who are like-minded and try to brainstorm. And they might end up being a community like the few thousand AI people that we have. But this time, this super small community is called Health Hackers. So we meet every week. We talk about what does it take as high performance business owners and startup folks to sustain that high performance every day? Like, what does that mean about physical health, mental health, social health, and all of those good things?
Any surprises so far?
I'm very bad at all of those areas of health,
What's
which is
what's
not
the
very surprising, but I'm
what
learning how far I am from where I need to be.
what's the worst?
Mental health. So, having, physical health is something that I've always been okay at. But in the past few years, because of the pandemic lockdown and
Yeah.
all, that's a bit on the back burner. I'm just getting back into it. But that's a thing that I'm a lot more familiar with how to get back on track. But mental health is not something that I've worked on at all for, the past several decades of my life. So, learning how to deal with that is very interesting and, a lot of room to learn. And as a community builder, I always assume that I'm very good at social health, but that's another thing that I'm learning that I'm not good at. And a lot of my community building tendencies is to overcompensate for, my lack of social health in some areas.
I want to get into that. But before we do, let's share a little bit of kind of the backstory and how we met up. So we met up through a connection that I had through Pavilion on some stuff that you were working on just a little bit over a year ago, all really in this space of the way that I would describe it. And this is so we're going in the Wayback Machine, but it was in this space of how do we accelerate learning, knowledge transfer, access to information, and thinking specifically for engineers, leveraging AI and natural and NLP. Where are you now? Like, where are you focused? How has things shifted in that space? Why did they shift in that space? And then I want to get into some of the deeper stuff around AI and machine learning and large language models and all of the really kind of like deeper tech type stuff. But that we met in this discussion when it was around how do we help people accelerate speed to knowledge. What are you doing these days?
Yeah, definitely. So the problem statement is still very, very similar. So the problem statement about a year ago when we met was how can we use AI and similar technologies to facilitate how humans interact with knowledge? And knowledge is usually documented in some form and shape, most of the time in textual format. So therefore, we needed to use natural language processing to facilitate interaction of people with this knowledge. And, as you said, at the time when we met, we were very focused on what does this mean for engineers? Like, can we create systems that facilitate how machine learning engineers interact with, for example, machine learning research publications and documentations and GitHub repositories and all of the good artifacts that they have to use in everyday work. But since we spoke and now ChatGPT happened, and that really changed a lot of things, including like the very first thing that it changed what was the expectation of the users from what our platform was doing.
Ah,
Because
okay.
to that point, a lot of people were like, I don't need your platform, I'll just Google. But immediately after that, people were like, can I not ask my questions from the system? which was a very interesting, transition in user expectation, and the market shift was very, very radical, when ChatGPT happened. So in the past few months, we've been trying to figure out what all of these things mean for our platform and sort of the evolution of that, and trying to, deal with the bear market situation going on in terms of capital, encouraged us to look at who's going to need what we've built so far right now and is willing to pay for it right now. And that brought us to sales departments. So right now we are very focused on, what does knowledge management mean within a sales department? For example, the amount of time, a business development representative is a solution architect, a sales engineer spends time on synthesizing knowledge from many different resources to write a proposal, to write, a case study, to write a white paper, to write any sort of other customer facing documents. So that's where we are right now, and happy to go deeper.
Yeah, well, and these are topics that, as you know, are near and dear to my heart. The variables that we have humans who interact with other humans, who interact with technology, who operate within some kind of system or process. Ideally, as they interact with those other humans, they're dealing with other systems and processes and technology, and then you add in this information piece. So let's talk a bit about how do you work through that challenge of, there's so much information that's out there, information that's available publicly, information that's private, like in one-on-one conversations. And there's so much pressure out there relative to the speed at which things move along, both internally, like from a sales perspective inside an organization, but also on the client side relative to solving for the problem. So how can tools like AI and any of the iterations that are associated that kind of branch off of it, how can tools like AI help the human do better human things in this context?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question with a very difficult answer. So the reason that the answer is difficult is that the types of information, the type of knowledge that we each use in our work is very different and diverse. And, creating one system, for example, that is based on a bunch of heuristics and rules to govern all types of knowledge we want to handle is just out of question, because the diversity of the knowledge that we have to leverage to do our work as knowledge workers is so large that rule-based systems are completely out of question. Even like the more classical machine learning approaches are very, very difficult to be able to really handle the diversity of the knowledge that we need. So that's why in the past few years, because of our much larger machine learning models that handle language, aka large language models, we've finally getting to a point where we have AI systems that can handle that diversity, that can handle that free format input data that is coming to these systems. So if I want to just abstract away a lot of these complexities and just talk on a very high level about what does it take to build a product that does this effectively. So the very first step is integration into a bunch of systems that provide all of the knowledge data points that you need. Like, for example, you and I create content. So we read tens of articles per piece of content. We might watch a bunch of videos. We might talk to a bunch of people, et cetera, et cetera. Or, if you're doing a sales call, we might research the person's social media. We might read their company's blog posts. So there are all these different data sources that, first of all, need to be aggregated into one system. So just bringing all of this in with enough metadata to create this data fabric, if you wish, that sits at the bottom of everything is very important. The next step is to index this knowledge in a way that is usable by any sort of secondary application that sits on top of this. And that's what large language models give us, but also the more general topic of semantic or hybrid search enables us to do. And the third layer is the user experience. So how are you going to make this data fabric that you created, this indexing that you created, available to the user within their workflow? And there are many, many interesting topics to go into there. But, a few very interesting ones for me are, how can you integrate this new phenomena into the workflow that the user has. Because if you introduce it as a separate app, as a separate backflip that they have to do in their workflow, adoption is going to suffer, especially because this is a completely new way of thinking. And the second thing is the multiplayer nature, because a lot of the time you think about knowledge management, and if you search for knowledge management, the majority of content you see online is about personal knowledge management. While the majority of knowledge management we do at work is multiplayer. Like if I'm a sales engineer, I'm usually working with the account executive, with the marketing, executives, with a few of the salespeople, with the BDR, with the SDR, etc. And all of us together are collecting our knowledge. Maybe one of us was leading, but knowledge from all of these players are coming in async or synchronously to create this ultimate good, awesome outcome. So designing for that multiplayer behavior is extremely interesting and challenging, but that's the thing that needs to happen. Otherwise, you just created a single point solution that might or might not make a small, improvement in the overall system, but it won't change the system.
I think the view of multiplayer is fascinating, and I've not heard it referred to in this manner. Yet all of a sudden a light bulb went, like a spark happened, a light bulb went off. And you think about the multiplayers that are involved and how different their vocabulary is, or what their perspective is of a certain situation, or how they might describe a certain uh, situation. So how do you deal with the secret decoder ring or Rosetta Stone of being able to pull multiplayer information together? Is that a challenge that you're working through?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the data fabric that I talked about is the first step. Obviously,
Okay.
you have to, like, if each individual, for example, is having a call with a client and they're
Yep.
transcribing that call. So the very first and the most basic thing to do is to make sure that all of these transcripts are being ingested into a singular system, right?
Yes.
Like
Yep.
they are all existing, like some of it is in Zoom, some of it is in Google Meet, some of it is in whatever AI tool that transcribes calls now.
Sure.
So that's not helpful. Like you cannot really. So first of all, breaking the silos and bringing in all the data in one place is the very first, the most necessary basic step that you can take to create a multiplayer system, because everybody is putting inputs into the system. But then at the level of UX, thinking about scenarios where multiplayer behavior is very natural and organic is very important. So, like if you take a step back and look at an example, like tools like Slack, like Teams, or many other communication tools in one category, and then the second category, a lot of word processing tools that we use when we are doing our knowledge work are naturally multiplayer. Like Slack, you can write something, Joe can come in and respond, Jack can come in, and then Jane can come in and respond. So, together as a multiplayer scenario, we are creating this, multiplayer experience that results in some artifact. So
Yep.
now imagine that AI agent is introduced as one of these players in a Slack. So instead of completely creating a new experience, I can introduce my AI as a bot, as yet another Slack member into our conversation. So this Slack bot can either proactively or reactively engage in the conversations, right? So that's a very organic and natural place where the user experience of multiplayer can happen. Same thing in a word processing like Google Doc. So usually I write a document, you come in and comment on a bunch of things. Then, Joe comes in, and so imagine now an AI assistant is also one of these people that either carries out the tasks, like, I write a sales proposal. You come in and say, I think this paragraph needs more, references and a more assertive tone. And then I'll go at AI assistant, please rewrite this in this way. Right. So that's a multiplayer scenario. Like it is very organic in how you and I and a third person might work. But AI is just one more persona added to this interaction that we already have as part of our workflow.
And do you feel like there's a shift in the market where people are more comfortable with embracing AI as an assistant rather than a replacement?
That's a $1 billion question, isn't it? So I think there is still that a struggle that is going on between the narrative that tries to say oh, we need efficiency, therefore we need to replace people, versus, oh, we need efficiency, therefore we need to augment people so that they can focus on what people are good at. There's definitely more comfort, I would say. Like there are a lot of people that are more comfortable thinking that AI can help them do their job better.
Mm.
But I would say that that question is far from settled yet. So
How how will we settle it? Like how does a question like that? And I know I'm asking you to kind of look in the future and play kind of world build for a minute here, but like how does that question get settled?
just positive examples in my mind, being putting my product person hat on. I think a big part of the responsibility is on product people, how they design their user experiences. So like if you design a user experience that radiates the fact that this thing is going to replace you one day, versus a user experience where, and that's why I like the multiplayer scenarios much better, because in multiplayer scenario it's rare that I feel like you're going to replace me as a colleague, like we're just collaborating.
Right.
But in a single person scenario, it's a lot easier to feel that, oh, damn, this thing might replace me because it is very good at things that I usually do. Right. So I think, again, like this is very high level and hand wavy, but I
Sure.
think a lot of it will come down to user experiences. Because if you have enough user experiences that are positive and help you achieve what you want and focus your time on things that are more valuable to you as a worker, then those examples can be used as an anchor to create a new narrative. I don't think marketing is going to fix it. I don't think positioning is going to fix it. It's just good, positive experiences.
Yeah, it seems like there's an opportunity for people to lead well in this space. And if we there are different ways to lead. Like you can lead with the push forward, this is the objective, this is the way the world is going to go. And then there's also the no, let's go together, let's learn, let's be open to the idea of change and where things are going, and how this is kind of an early adopter thing. And I guess a question I've got, or where would you say we are on this kind of adoption S curve when it comes to AI tools, given how crazy the last almost 10 months have been since ChatGPT became more widely known or more accessible? Where would you say we are in where are we in this kind of continuum, this life cycle, this
Yeah.
curve? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've definitely been seeing the ramp up part of the curve in the past probably 5 to 6 years as far as natural language processing goes. About 5 years ago, there were a lot of, corporate use cases for natural language processing, but they were largely in the fringes compared to, structured data and, time series forecasting and things like that. But in the past, 5 to 6 years, there has been a lot of new interesting developments like transformers, which are the backbone of, GPT, came out, and they really showed a way to us to handle that diversity of patterns that language has, right? So
Okay.
that has definitely been the ramp up in the past few years. I would say, GPT model that is the backbone of ChatGPT, like the closest model came out, more than a year ago, definitely, like probably about 18 months ago. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember the dates, but about 18 months ago came out. It was available as an API to developers. A lot of people were building with it. A lot of, good famous companies like Copy AI, Jasper came out as a result of that API becoming available. And those are like the early adopters, that kind of technology, but it was only developer friendly. And that was the case, although the model was evolving and becoming better and better. That continued being the case until November 2022, when OpenAI made a very interesting product decision to release their next model as a chat interface instead of the usual API, and that created the whole hype. And I think that really leapfrogged us from being on the, ramp up to the peak of the hype, to the peak of the hype. And we are sort of like coming down from the peak, I think, because, as you probably have noticed earlier this year, everybody was going crazy. It's a little more calmer now. Like, a lot of initial crazy ideas died out, and the more serious ones are sort of coming up and, continuing to exist. So I think we're still at the peak of the hype, kind of starting to settle down, but it's interesting to see where it goes.
But and I think it's important to highlight a piece that you had talked about here, which is that a lot of the capability has been out there for a while and it's been evolving for a period of time. So it's not like this is something new that just flipped. There's an inner access, the ability to access the knowledge and play with it and test and create some things has changed. But this is all standing on a mountain of work over a number of years. Is that fair?
100%. Like even some of the projects that became very popular, and every single person who was building with LLMs like LangChain sits on existed before all of this craziness. But they just really came to the forefront of the attention of people because of the hype that ChatGPT created. A lot of companies were putting out large language models, open source and otherwise, with different levels of performance, competing and or better than what ChatGPT was able to do. But people were just not paying attention. It wasn't just a cool topic in town.
So let's talk a bit about the mental health side of things. So like you mentioned earlier mental health, and you brought it together in this combination of both mental health, community, perspective relative to just health in general. So we've got the mind, body, spirit kind of view. And other people will talk about financial health. Like there's a number of different perspectives that we can take here. But let's talk about the mental health aspect. Are there ways that you see AI tools like ones we've talked about here and access to information and knowledge management starting to influence and help and create space for folks who might be struggling with some of the mental challenges of burnout or just kind of list them all through. How do you see AI assisting in this in some way, shape, or form? And do you have any experience around that?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about cognition, obviously, because
Okay.
language is a representation of cognition, right? Like our ability to be intellectual,
Yeah.
our ability to be intelligent is normally represented as our ability to handle language, like either to produce it and or to understand it. So therefore, there are many, many different ways that you can dissect the question you asked. So, in terms of the relationship between that and other types of health, one thing that I've recently been learning more about and trying to understand more deeply is the relationship between cognitive health and all of the other things. Because
Right.
cognitive health is an important thing that when you get to the old age, a lot of old age problems are because of cognitive decline. So what can you do in your decades up to that point to reduce the impact of cognitive decline? So all of the physical health, mental health, et cetera, all of this becomes the forefront when you think, okay, the objective is that I want not to have old age problems when you get to that point. So and a lot of this comes up in the context of Alzheimer's disease and dementia and all that,
Yep.
which has a significant interaction with language. So a lot of the time, some of the signals or symptoms is that you lose your ability to handle language. So that's a very interesting topic from that point of view. That's more on an abstract level. But how have I been helping myself learn about these topics is ChatGPT and similar tools recently, because unlike many of my previous attempts at doing this, I don't have to sit down and read a bunch of SEO documents. I can just talk to ChatGPT about, I'm trying to optimize this part of my health. What are the steps? I'm trying to learn about this other thing. or like very recently, this is a very peculiar, social interaction I had. How could I have handled it differently? And of course, it's not the authoritative recipe for how to do your life, but it can give me a few keywords to look up, a few things to think about, etc., etc. So from that point of view, it's been very helpful in educating me about this new journey I'm on. But you could also imagine taking this further, because ChatGPT is a very generic tool, and this generic tool gives you generic answers. But you could imagine creating systems that are actually trained and fine-tuned on mental health support, on physical health support, different types of health support systems, and are able to, give you citations to their resources, give you, expert opinions, give you something that is more personalized to you as a person, et cetera, et cetera. So you could definitely take that further by enriching the data that sits on the back end of these systems. And one of the very interesting, and you started talking about this in terms of planning, sorry, in terms of mental health. And one of the things that I've learned is that a lot of the time I suffer from anxiety and other types of mental health problems because I haven't planned well. And these tools, the way they're trained, are that they're very good at telling you high level steps and you can fill in the blanks, et cetera, et cetera. So that their ability to plan is something that is evolving and getting better. And I think that has a significant one-to-one correlation with, enabling you to be better. And lastly, I started by saying language is a cornerstone of what we consider intelligence. And that's not true, really. I mean, it is, but that's a very bad association. I wrote a LinkedIn post about it. You can link to it recently. And the problem is, what about all of the people that we have in a society that don't have the linguistic capabilities that a normal citizen has, right? So they might be immigrants, they might be, have other types of cognitive challenges, et cetera, et cetera. So language is not a tool that they can use effectively to reflect their intelligence, to interact with the world, to interact with the rest of us when it comes to the multiplayer scenarios that we were talking about. So can these models become an interface between us and people that are currently marginalized and are not part of the common narrative, right? So that's and a lot of the time we associate mental social health problems to them. While is that actually true or not is a question to debate.
I moved from northern New Jersey to Southern California in 1988 as a during spring break my freshman year in high school, and my accent was a bit different then than it is now. And there are immediate interpretations that we make when we hear those accents, whether it's from the Northeast or it's from the Southeast or it's from another country. And I think this is a very interesting piece that comes up when you start to say, okay, what happens if an assistant does not create a judgment based on that accent immediately? And how can that actually enable better things to happen faster inside organizations? I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, 100%. Like the question of unwanted bias is definitely a very big question, right? So in all machine learning, but in AI, sorry, in natural language processing and language modeling more specifically, and one of the very, very important things that the backend of ChatGPT did compared to all the previous models was what we call, alignment with human preference, which means that they specifically created a bunch of data sets where they showed the model a bunch of examples of, if you're prompted with this, string of characters with these words, these are the things that you're likely to produce. And a human's preference is to see this one first, then this one, then this one, et cetera, et cetera. And then they train an additional model that sits on top of that model and essentially guides the generation of this model to be more aligned with human preference. So that, in principle, reduces a bit of bias in the system, but it introduces another factor of the bias, because which human's preference? So that's a new tool in the toolbox in terms of, aligning to preferences. But, that's a tool that we have at least to handle some of the biases in written language. But a lot of communication are nonverbal. Like I'm saying things, you're nodding, I get encouraged to keep saying the same things, et cetera, right? So, and none of that exists. An accent is part of that nonverbal communication. Like it indicates where I'm from. It indicates, a lot of peculiarities about me. And, seeing that signal and using it towards a good bias is the name of the game, I think, rather than completely removing it, because that's part of the communication that we have.
So before we get back onto the sales side of things, one of the kind of dots that's connecting for me here as we're talking through specifically on the mental health side of stuff and mental and physical health is that so I use an Aura ring, and my Aura ring gives me a lot of data. I can look back at data over the past couple of years and see some things that have happened from both a sleep and a movement perspective and a heart rate perspective. So recovery, both the amount of time that I'm investing in sleep, what I'm doing relative to how my heart rate's responding, and what I'm doing relative to movement. And if I look back, I can see where lack of sleep and lack of movement combined with negative external experiences can create a very quick path to burnout or stress or anxiety or whatever the negative thing is that you want to talk through. I can go through and do that because I've got the data and I can look back. But imagine what could happen if I got a nudge that said, "Hey, dude, your sleep is a little bit low. You're not moving as much as you usually are. Watch out for some of these negative stimulus, because if a negative stimulus comes up, it could put you down a negative path." Is that the direction we're going? Like, do we see that kind of an assist that's potentially out there? Is that part of the future that might be the positive future that might be out there for us?
Yeah, I see two very, very interesting points. So I'm going to take a step forward, 5 years into the future,
Yeah.
when notifications are no longer a thing. So right now, a lot of apps that we use, if you're inactive for a while, they might give you a buzz or something that says you're inactive, get your ass moving, right? And that's a notification. It's very easy for me to dismiss it. It's very easy for me to think, well, it's not taking into account the fact that I'm very busy today, or the fact that I didn't sleep well last night, or blah, 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 right? So it is just very local, to the point that makes it very easy for me to dismiss it. Like the impact of it is just notification. I just dismiss it and move on.
Right.
So 5 years forward, think about a point in the future where you don't have notifications, but interventions. So first of all, this notification comes at a place where instead of just a pop-up, a system starts talking to me and says, I noticed that you're slower today. What is going on? And I say, well, I didn't sleep well last night. Then it says, oh, okay, so is it because of the anxiety of that meeting you had yesterday? And you just engage in a conversation, like that intervention that the system is making, like a good friend would make for you. And, it gives you enough context and motivation that you're like, oh my God, I need to go out and run right now. Or, right. So it's a very, very different dynamic. It's a very different way of getting you to do things, because it is giving you context. It is sympathizing with your situation. So that's the future I would like to get to. But like, what's the path to get there? When you describe the data coming from your ring or other types of trackers, it's usually a structured data. It is a bunch of data that sits in tables, like, today, these are the factors, tomorrow, these are the factors, yesterday, et cetera, et cetera. And that's different inherently than the usual stuff that goes into language models. So it's very interesting that if we can bring these two types of data together, so not only the structured data and aggregations we do on top of a structured data, but also all of the natural language related things. For example, a system that looks at the transcripts of my conversation, notices that I was frustrated in a meeting with a customer,
Yeah.
correlates that with my sleep pattern or activity patterns, and then points that out and says, I notice you were very short with the customer. Maybe it is because you weren't doing these things that is correlated with lack of physical. That's a lot more convincing and useful. And that's something that language models, even the ones that we have today, can do. Like they can essentially write code to analyze the structured data from your tracker and then get the aggregate numbers, put it in the context of the large language model, and write a few paragraphs about it looks like this is happening. These might be the reasons, et cetera, et cetera.
So I'm struggling with what question to ask next, which is the challenge around ethics associated with access to the data and what happens with ethical use of data versus shifting more directly into the discussion around what you're doing to help on the sales side. So I'll ask you, do you have one that you'd rather get into? And then I'll ask the other one. But what do you think about the ethics piece versus and how does this apply to what you're building on the sales side when you think about all of the data that you're pulling in to do some of the really cool things that you're doing with some of the modeling work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean the topic of ethics is definitely a very relevant topic, and I don't love ethics as a label for this conversation. I think that the more appropriate label is responsibility. So how
Oh,
can
okay.
you use AI in a more responsible way? Because ethics is relative. Do you move from point A to point B? And ethics completely change. Like this person says, yes, we have to kill these types of animals. The other one is like, oh my God, that's the worst thing in the world. So was same with the human preferences, right? Who's the point of reference? But
Yes.
responsibility is something that we can agree on, right? So it is more responsible not to hurt things. Like these are the short list of principles we want to have as a responsible use of technology, right? So so how can we do that? That's very hard to answer in general, but there are many smart people that are spending a lot of time on it. Like this whole human preference alignment that I talked about is a step forward. I have a lot of questions about, who's humans preference, but I don't think that has an easy answer. But one of the very interesting patterns that are happening in the large language model space that goes beyond ChatGPT like systems is that ChatGPT is one model with a front end, but we are creating a lot of systems where a lot of large language model agents collaborate with each other. And a
Mm,
very interesting thing that is happening is that a lot of these ecosystem of large language model agents include a component, an agent that is the critic. It is an agent that, for example, imagine if in ChatGPT, you could ask a question, the backend goes, finds a bunch of information, brings it from the unstructured data. Another agent goes to your tracker and brings a bunch of information. The third agent goes somewhere else and brings a bunch of information. And then another agent comes in and says, this is my critical feedback about the first piece of information. This is the critical. And then that process repeats a bunch of times in the backend before it shows you an answer. That's a much more responsible way to do it, of course,
yes.
if done right. So, and we are building systems like that. And I'm excited to see what kind of agents we can create that will help us build more responsible systems.
I really like the shift from ethics to responsibility. And that's powerful. So very cool. So let's talk about the stuff that you're building right now and kind of how this all kind of plays together. What are you working on?
Yeah, so sort of the multi-agent system that I described is exactly what we're building. So we're building a system called Sherpa. It is an assistant, and just a quick side note, Sherpas is inspired by shepherds that live in Tibet and usually help people climb the Mount Everest. And what I really like about Sherpas, or the concept of Sherpa, is that these are people that always help you climb the Mount Everest. They never do it on your behalf. So
Yes.
it is always a collaborative effort between this assistant and a bunch of people that are trying to achieve an objective. So that's the system you're building. It's a multi-agent large language model based system. As I said, a bunch of large language models. Each of them are expert in an activity like critical feedback, like writing code, like getting information from the structured data or otherwise, and bring it all together. And then an agent that is the brain that tells everybody what to do. an agent that brings it all together and shows it to the user. So it's a system that a bunch of these agents collaborate with each other to do stuff. And the type of stuff that they can do is, for example, question answering. So again, like imagine ChatGPT, but all of this interesting collaboration is happening in the backend before it gives you an answer. Or more interestingly, what we're interested in is using a system like this to write long and complex documents. So like the amount of time you might, as a salesperson, spend on writing a sales proposal might be, kind of unreasonable. And that's a very important document to get right with all the important factual grounded details articulated properly, with recall of all the interesting things you thought about before. And it's just like, what would I search to even find a paragraph I wrote? Right. So it can fetch all of this information, put it in a proposal type of document or other types of customer facing documents, response to RFPs, case studies, et cetera, et cetera. It can write a first draft for you. And, in the future, we haven't developed this part yet, but imagine that you could go in and highlight a bunch of places, write comments for it, or all the colleagues would do that. Then the assistant will come in, does a revision on the document, and you just collaborate with the system to write your documents much more effectively and efficiently. I say efficiently and effectively because both of those are important. Like you want to increase the output, but you also want to increase the outcome. So hopefully we can do more of that. And just if I can put out a call to action, we are actually starting to deploy the system for some commercial clients. So if you're in the space, we're primarily interested in service type of companies and science-based companies who do a lot of knowledge-intensive type of work. And we're selecting a few companies that we will deploy the system for them and specifically adapt it to their scenarios and use cases and data sources. So please reach out. I'm on LinkedIn and everywhere, and happy to discuss more.
Yeah, and we'll include links in the show notes and take Amir up on this. The opportunity to engage and kind of work through. Here's some of the questions that he and his team will be asking, and then I'm sure some of the questions that you and your team will have out there. So can you give a little bit more detail? So service organizations and science, or people who are operating in the service space or the science space, how large, like what kind of data should they have access to today for this to make sense from an engagement standpoint?
Yeah, so essentially we are looking for companies that have documented processes.
Yep.
And documented some sort of a centralized knowledge base. It doesn't need to be super centralized, but it can't be a very small company that is just trying to figure out how to even share knowledge with their own teammates.
Yep.
Because if that data doesn't exist, our system can't be very helpful. Yep. So any team that has some level of knowledge documentation that is a shared knowledge base amongst the workers in a company. So this could be like, I don't know, a consulting company, like an IT consulting company. Yep. That has a bunch of documentation around their processes and services and case studies and et cetera, et cetera. Or it could be a science-based company, like an agri-tech company, like a biotech company, et cetera, that does frequently grant proposals or things like that. But they also have like a central repository of examples of what they've done in the past, papers that are relevant to them, et cetera. And when I say central library, I don't necessarily mean something super organized. It could be a Google Drive with all of these documents in it, right? So we have data connectors for many different systems. As long as a base level set of documents exist, it's good to go. We can work with them. As I said, like we can also connect to structured data. So if combination of documents and structured data is attractive and important, that's definitely something we can handle. An example of that would be you want to write sales proposals and you want to plug in a bunch of relevant numbers from your success rate, from your market predictions and other types of things that you can be aggregated from tables of previous engagements and tables of market intelligence and things like
that. So if you have a process that's documented and you have data that exists across systems, and You probably have put together some giant playbook around how you go to market, but nobody opens it or looks at it. You might just be the right person to talk to Amir about some of the things that he in the team in his team are working on. Amir, best place for people to connect with you is going to be LinkedIn.
LinkedIn is definitely a good place. I'm very responsive there, as you know.
Amir, anything else to share with folks, either that we didn't get into, or you kind of are just as you've been jotting some things down, something where you kind of said, oh, I wish we would have talked about that. Is there anything, any closing comments before we wrap things up here?
No, I think we covered quite a bit of ground. So hopefully that will be helpful for people. I just quickly repeat my CTA, which is if you are working in service or science-based industries and you want to be a leader in your niche, it doesn't matter how small it is, but you want to be ahead of the curve. That's the kind of persona that really resonates with what we're doing and can tap into the potential we're bringing to the table. I would love to hear more about what you're doing today and how we can amplify it using the systems we're building.
Awesome. Make sure you connect with Amir. If you know of someone who would find this conversation valuable, please share it with them. Let us know via LinkedIn. It's good to see the sharers. When you share it with others, more and more people get attracted to the content. And that's ultimately what I'm looking for with this podcast, is to help people find their catalyst so they can start solving tough problems, work through challenges that they're working through. Sales is a thinking process. Business is a thinking process. Life is a thinking process. How are you thinking differently about your process?